Well, thank you very much, Jakob, for the introduction. As he explained, I'm going to speak today a little bit about our experience in the UK in relation to product carbon footprinting, and with specific reference to PAS 2050 and the review of the PAS 2050. I think I should say at the outset that the content of my presentation is going to be a very, very brief background on PAS 2050, PAS 2050 in use, the evaluation project that we've done on the PAS, the lessons we've learned from that project and also other feedback, the review and what that's going to entail, international developments, and also future policy development. I think I should say at the outset, and this mirrors, it's been very interesting listening to all the presentations today, that a lot of what I was going to say, a lot of the comments actually I was going to make the same one. So for example, I should say at the outset that in the UK we see carbon footprinting as but one part of the wider discussion on addressing environmental impacts overall. Many businesses in the UK already report on their carbon emissions, Scope 1 and 2, as part of the corporate reporting process. And of course, we've got a target in our climate change legislation in the UK, which calls for a reduction in national carbon emissions of 80% by 2050. However, given that most adverse environmental impacts can be attributed to the production and consumption of goods and services, with impacts occurring throughout the life cycle, a business which assesses and reports on just Scope 1 and 2 is ignoring a significant part of a product's life cycle where the negative environmental impact may well be greater. We therefore support and encourage the life cycle assessment approach because we feel that with a greater understanding of all elements of the life cycle, businesses are better placed to consider their impacts throughout the supply chain in addition to their carbon footprint. However, as Michele said earlier today, we see carbon footprinting as a start, not least in raising awareness of environmental issues, something which we feel is fundamental to people taking action, is getting them to be aware of what the issues are in the first place. Having said all that, my presentation is going to give you an update on our thinking on how we see product carbon footprinting developing, particularly within the context of our review of PAS 2050, which has just got underway. I know that many, if not all of you, are aware or have a very good knowledge of PAS 2050, particularly those who are life cycle assessment practitioners, and so I'm not intending to go into too much detail about how it came into being. Suffice to say that it was launched in October 2008 in response to demand from industry, particularly the food sector, for a robust assessment methodology to measure greenhouse gas emissions at all stages of a product's life cycle and throughout the supply chain. It was designed to be used on any product by any company in any geographic location. So in effect, it provided a standard which was capable of global application, using a common assessment approach and delivering consistency. And as somebody mentioned today, it was the first published standard. The PAS itself is owned by the British Standards Institution, which is our national standards body. And over the years, BSI has developed defined processes for its standards-making activities and for a publicly available specification, which is what PAS stands for. And this includes a maintenance review every 2 years to ensure the specification is up to date and technically sound. So we've heard earlier today also about maintenance issues in terms of data gathering, for example, but there's also a maintenance issue in relation to standards because they're not really of much value if they're not kept up to date. So PAS 2050, in effect, was recognized from the outset as not being perfect. And at the time of its launch, it was clearly stated that it would be reviewed within 2 years. That review, as I mentioned earlier, has just got underway and is expected to be completed in the first quarter of 2011. So what do we see the review delivering? We see it delivering an updated standard, which has been improved as a result of input from LCA experts and more specifically users of the standard. A standard which is easier to use and which therefore has increased uptake by business. And a standard which goes further in meeting the original PAS aspirations so that it really is applicable to all products and services in all locations. And this also goes to the thinking, again, which was mentioned by a speaker earlier today, of embedding LCA thinking within the corporate strategic thinking. These are ambitious aims, but we shouldn't shy away from doing what we can to achieve them, not least because we see it as essential that business has the right tools to assess greenhouse gas impacts throughout the supply chain in order to be able to determine and then take the appropriate action to reduce those impacts. The emphasis here being on taking action to reduce impacts, and I'll come back to that later. The review itself will follow BSI's established review process, which is predicated on transparency, extensive and open consultation, and technical robustness. The main elements of the process include a steering group who will oversee the process, and this will be comprised of academics, LCA experts, international standard-making bodies, government and industry representatives. Technical development supported by national and international expert input. Extensive consultation with those having an interest in the PAS, such as business, LCA practitioners, governments, consumer groups, non-governmental organizations, and a detailed survey of those who have downloaded the PAS from the BSI website, and that's over 20,000. So a survey has already been sent out to over 20,000 people who have downloaded. When this process has been completed, our aim is to have a revised standard specification, which is of benefit to businesses throughout the supply chain who produce goods and services, and those who consume those goods and services, and that's customers in the broadest sense. So a consumer at a certain point in the supply chain could also be a supplier in another context. And for businesses, it also helps them to identify risks and prioritize the action that they need to take. As I mentioned earlier, PAS was welcomed as filling a gap in the market when it was launched in October 2008. But even at its launch, some elements were highlighted for further consideration in the upcoming review within the 2-year period. Some of those items which were recognized as needing further work were indirect land use change, carbon storage and soils, capital goods, and recycling. It was also suggested that the ILC database might serve as a recommended data source and that the use of product category rules should be considered. So even at the time that PAS 2050 was launched, it was recognized we have a tool here, we've taken a first stab at getting something out there which people can follow, but it isn't perfect, and these are the things we need to be looking at in the future that we know of at the time of the launch. So, PAS 2050 in use. We've obviously got ample evidence to show that PAS 2050 is well recognized and it's respected internationally, and it's been used for the carbon footprinting of a wide range of products and services in many countries, often across long and complex supply chains. Indeed, it's been referred to, as you know, frequently by speakers and participants in this and in previous summit meetings of the PCF World Forum. However, what is interesting to note is that not all users have applied PAS 2050 for the same purpose. For example, one leading UK-based international retailer who has taken a prominent position in supporting sustainable consumption and production principles is using PAS 2050 to carbon footprint hundreds of its own brand products across many different product categories, and then has chosen to flag up its carbon credentials by putting labels on the packs of around 100 product lines. On the other hand, other leading retailers have used PAS 2050 to undertake supply chain analysis, but then have decided not to go down the route of product labels, but rather to take action on what the supply chain analysis has given them. We then have other suppliers who have footprinted all lines within a product category, while many others have footprinted all their product lines. And the latter has really been in anticipation of requests from major customers, such as large retailers. And I think this last fact is quite important because it actually points out the power that large retailers or large companies have to be able to influence the behavior along the supply chain and therefore to drive change. I've already mentioned user feedback and its importance in the review. Indeed, you could say that the review has been in mind almost since the PAS was launched. Since shortly after the launch, DEFRA commissioned a project to evaluate the effectiveness of the PAS on 3 products, 2 manufactured goods and 1 service. And for those of you who are familiar with the term, product in the PAS is intended to cover both manufactured goods and services. The project was principally to inform the revision of the PAS and also to develop our strategic thinking in product carbon footprinting area. So we had 3 companies with 3 products. There was a paint, some baby wipes, and an IT service which is used by farmers. The project was overseen by a project consultant. The companies had to use the PAS 2050, record their experiences, and document the lessons they'd learned from it. And the project consultant's role was to provide support where it was needed, report on the company's experiences, and then make recommendations to the department as to what they saw as being needed as an outcome of the project. The initial project findings were shared with stakeholders in December 2009, and we invited a very large number of stakeholders to that event because we saw it as an opportunity to gain further input from companies who had used PAS 2050 or had attempted to use it and perhaps abandoned it outside the actual evaluation project itself. And indeed, that event proved immensely valuable. So what we have also done, we've incorporated the additional user feedback from that event into the report. And the report should be available on the DEFRA website within the next 2 or 3 weeks. And I'm happy to send the details for that, but keep a lookout for it. So what were the lessons learned from this? In addition to the specific lessons learned which came out of the DEFRA project and the dissemination event referred to just now, we were also getting informal general feedback as more businesses began to use the PAS. And I'm now going to give a very broad summary of the issues raised and the comments made. And I think what will strike you in this is that a lot of the comments have already been raised, both from the road testing from the GHG protocol draft and also the road testers themselves. So it was very much welcomed by business. It was seen as filling a gap in the market. They thought the step-by-step process was very straightforward and provided a good structure for undertaking product or service footprinting. The guide in particular was seen as very useful, and speaking to one of the participants today, she did mention to me that she thought the PAS 2050 guidance was excellent because it does give you that step-by-step approach. And I think in reality we have to think that many people don't actually refer to the PAS document itself when they're doing their footprint. They tend very much to work from the guidance. The evaluation project indicated that user needs differed and that depending on the needs of the user, further information might be needed. So, for example, some users wanted help in the questions they put to their suppliers in getting data and the questions they asked of them. And I think this goes back to perhaps some of the stuff that came out of the GHG protocol feedback, where people wanted templates for how they approach their suppliers. So it's interesting, the similarities in the feedback. They also wanted a practical method for assessing the footprint and ensure that others are measuring the same way. So there was very much there were elements of how you deal with the uncertainty, which is still in the method. It was acknowledged that some products by themselves are inherently more difficult. For example, if you've got a very long, complex and variable supply chain, that can be difficult. Where you've got multiple actors, it makes it more difficult. And certain sectors were highlighted as difficult, and one of them I think has already been mentioned today, and that was agriculture, which I think people see as big, and food perhaps, and chemicals. They came out as being quite difficult. They also saw the method itself as presenting some challenges. For example, the 100-year accounting rule, carbon storage, the recycling, wanted more guidance on that, primary data collection, renewables, how to treat them, land use, allocation requirements. A lot of these, as I've said, have already been picked up today. So there's a similarity in the story that's unfolding, I think, in terms of use. There were some general issues, though, which were very prevalent, data being the primary one. Access to primary data, the lack of good quality secondary data in many areas, which generic data sets to use, and data was also identified as a barrier to take-up. And for us, we don't feel there's much point in having a standard if it's not taken up. But it was noted that there were greater insights from the supply chain where primary data were collected. It told you more about your product and you needed to know. Data collection process was easier where there were good relationships within the supply chain. But as somebody has pointed out to me, that's difficult if you've got a very long supply chain. There were also difficulties in collecting secondary data, and the nature and the level of the difficulty varied, as did its significance. So it's very much a case-by-case situation. However, there were two common issues which were identified. The need for a publicly available PAS-consistent, well, this was part of a PAS trial, so PAS-consistent set of emission factors for frequent flows, such as electricity, fuels, transportation, and waste management, and the need for widely publicly available databases such as the ELCD to be more accessible if they are to be cited in a standard as recommended data sources. It was also the handling of customer, consumer, and post-consumer behaviors to be factored in more clearly, so that was end-of-life issues. Clarity on what level of precision is fit for purpose, so depending whether you were going to use it for internal purposes or for external, and also comparability. There was a demand for a more prescriptive approach, and I think this goes back to something that Andrea brought up this morning, where there was, in some cases, people wanted more prescription in the standard. And in the comparability issue, it was suggested that product sector-specific rules might be one way of addressing that. Communication, they wanted flexibility in application and communication of results. There was no general appetite for labeling schemes. They wanted assurance that reductions reflected in any footprint, quote, number, are based on real differences in the product. They wanted clarity on how the data should be communicated, on pack, on web, whatever. How to address uncertainty. Materiality and prioritization were, as currently described in our guidance, was seen as not intuitive, and a more practical approach was needed. And they want to see the method developed further and identified robustness of consultation as being key. So the recommendations from the project. Data prioritization and materiality assessments, they said the purpose of this step should be to minimize the effort required to undertake a carbon footprint calculation. And in these trials, the reverse was found, interestingly. A need for sector or category-specific rules and or guidance. This was supported by the IT test in particular, in relation to staff commuting, for example. There were several suggestions relating to the PAS guidance, questionnaires for approaching suppliers and so forth, secondary data collection, more direction on sources, interpretation. Other support tools should be identified, for example, maybe a library of similar studies that have been done, process mapping tools, and any databases needed to be accessible in the sense of them being available to those who weren't necessarily LCA practitioners. Secondary data needed for a recognized source of full life cycle emission factors for common flows such as energy, transportation, and waste management. Secondary data sources to be accessible as well as available. So the review, what will the review be doing? It'll be considering the technical aspects that were already highlighted. It'll be reflecting all of the feedback that we've got from users and practitioners, and it will be taking account of related developing international initiatives. The initiatives we've already heard a lot about today, so I'm not going to go into any detail. Suffice to say that DEFRA has got an active role in all of these. In the ISO, we are represented through BSI and its delegates to the ISO process. The GHG protocol, we are on their steering group, and the ELCD, ILCD, we have been actively participating in discussions with the Commission and looking to see how what the Commission is doing can fit into our work on the review. For the steering group, we are intending to invite participants from both ISO, the GHG protocol, and also JRC to be on the steering group for the PAS review. these are also a lot of international initiatives, no particular reason for those being selected, but as you can see, there are a lot of initiatives out there, and we see the benefit of those as a part of the learning process and learning from them. Future policy developments. We very much see that PAS 2050 will inform our thinking on future policy direction. We see product footprinting as having a key role to play in getting businesses to reduce their carbon emissions and moving us towards a green, low-carbon economy. We took the lead in the UK in developing PAS 2050, and this review will enable us to assess its effectiveness and identify where it can be improved to increase uptake by business and support them in taking action to reduce their footprint. The lessons learned tell us that there are some practical aspects that still need to be addressed, most notably availability and accessibility of reliable and relevant data. And we should be looking at developments on the EU ILCD as a possible way forward in that area. We're also coming round to the view that PAS 2050 does not work on the one-size-fits-all principle, and that for practical purposes it needs to be underpinned by sector category-specific rules or guidance. And the review, I think it's important to stress, will be predicated on that basis. So it will be a generic standard underpinned by product or sector-specific rules, because that is the very clear message. So that isn't prejudicing or the outcome of the review, it's taking account of a very recognizable fact. One area I haven't touched on here, and I'm trying to speed up, is that communication. I think a significant difference between the GHG protocol and the PAS 2050, we see communication, and I think it's interesting that the ISO 14067 is in two parts. We see communication, we don't say that it's not relevant or indeed important, but as a separate and further step beyond the actual assessment and measurement of carbon emissions. Having calculated their carbon footprint, we want businesses to go beyond just communicating that information, for example, on a label. We want them to actually use the information they've gained in the assessment to identify where in their supply chain they can actually take action to reduce the carbon emissions and deliver environmental benefit. That being said, we do recognize that businesses may well want to communicate information that they've gleaned in the process to internal or external audiences, and in that regard, the caveats that are relating to communication, which were included in the previous PAS and in the guide, continue to hold true, particularly where communication is to an audience outside the organization and where the information is being used for marketing or comparison purposes. And there are, of course, added considerations to be factored in where the statement is used for making comparisons. Public communication of environmental information, such as carbon footprint, can be categorized, I think, as a green claim. And I'm just going to give a little plug here for our green claims guidance, which is about to be published. In the UK, we're keen to encourage robust green claims, and we're actually going to be publishing our updated guidance very shortly. A key principle of our guidance is that good green claim needs to be capable of being substantiated. And I think that lies at the heart of all of the communication issues relating to carbon footprinting. Because unless you've got a common benchmark for measuring, how do you, and this has been raised today, how do you compare? Somebody comes up with a number, somebody else comes up with another number. Unless you've got a consistent approach, how on earth do you know what value to place on those numbers, or indeed, even if it's not a number, just information, what value do you place on that information? This goes back to all of the basic things we see as being, you're claiming, in effect. Once you make a statement, it's a claim. So the principles in our guidance, we feel, will help companies make good claim, including think about what they're putting on a label or how they communicate any of the information. So I think, in conclusion, it's really gratifying to be at meetings where the influence of PAS 2050 in the carbon footprinting arena is acknowledged and praised. The mother of standards, as it was referred to, and the maturity, it was referred to in another one. I think our aim in conducting the review is to ensure that the resulting revised PAS will be equally influential and take us nearer to achieving our outcome of reducing carbon emissions across the supply chain. Thank you for your attention. I've galloped a little bit through it, and apologies for that. I'm happy to answer any questions, providing they're not too technical, because I'm not a life cycle assessment practitioner.
Well,